break, a quick 10 minutes to get a power nap in, some more tea and some more coffee. We're kicking off the next hour with Russ Weakly, who joins us from Sydney in Australia. Russ is well known to many people in the accessibility community as a speaker, writer, trainer, and a guy who knows plenty about coding, CSS, responsive design, and the like. And for ID24 this year, he's going to be talking to us about some design patterns for accessible floating labels. Russ, over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me?
We can.
Good. Okay, great. Well, yes, I'm going to be talking about creating these damn accessible labels that are floating. So a lot of people have seen them around, but I'll actually give a quick demo of what they are first, that everyone's on board. But before we start, I've actually set up a Git repo and a demo page. And there, if you're following the Twitter hashtag ID24, I just posted up links to not only the slide decks, but also to these two pages so you can have a look as we go along. So for those that aren't aware of them, what are these things called floating labels? So these floating labels are labels, they're label elements, and they're generally associated with inputs and text areas, not so much other form controls like selected area, but definitely inputs and text areas. And the way they work is the label elements are initially displayed on top of the form control, and then they're floated up and out of the form control when that form control receives focus. So here's a quick little diagram. We have the label element sitting what looks like inside, but is actually on top of the form control. And then when the user clicks into the form control, the label animates up and out of the form control to above. Now, this approach is often associated with something else. So it's not just about this label sliding up. It's also often used with this minimal design approach. And so what that means is that inputs and text area elements, they're often displayed with border bottom only. So in a traditional input, you've got borders all around the element, but they're all turned off except for the border bottom. And it's to imply this idea that you're actually writing on a line rather than writing into an input to receive data. Quick diagrams here. The first one is a traditional input. As you can see, there are borders all around it, and it's got a sense of definition about it. Whereas a floating input often looks literally like this. So it's just got a blue line and nothing else associated with it. In some cases, you'll see a soft label inside, but the actual input itself has virtually nothing input-y about it at all. So one of the big questions is why use them? And I'm going to be speaking on the opposite side, that I'm not a great fan of them in general, except in very specific circumstances. And we'll talk about that a bit later on, about where they could be very useful and who for. But the reason why I'm not a great fan of them is that they have some potential user experience and accessibility issues. So the question you're probably asking is, if you're not a fan, why present about them? And one of the reasons is because it's just fun. But recently I was working with a team and we were looking at all sorts of options, and they suggested that we could try these floating labels. And so before doing it in a real world environment, I wanted to try and build out some demos to see how they worked and whether they're accessible and how they work for users. So I decided to try and create a non-JavaScript version, and the aim was to try and make it as usable and as accessible as possible. So if nothing else, hopefully this presentation will give you some things to consider before jumping into using them, or if you are going to use them, some things to consider in how to build them. So I'm going to go through a bunch of concerns that I have with them in investigating them, and there's probably a lot more out there. But my fundamental one is this first concern, which is it even a form control? So my main concern is that this idea of a minimalist design means that it may not be clear to users that it's actually even a form control at all. And I'm sure, like a lot of you out there, I'm from a UX background. I've spent a lot of time watching people using forms, using applications. A lot of them have to do with forms, and people fundamentally are idiots. I mean, we'll all agree, myself included, but watching people using applications and forms, they do things you just cannot believe possible. They get things wrong in ways that you can't imagine. And if we're setting the bar so high for an input that it doesn't even look like an input, there's a strong possibility that some people may fail to recognize it as an input. So here's an example of a form that could look like a form to some but not to others. And we have first name, last name, and email. But as you'll see, the labels sit on top of the line, and there's no direct place for people to actually type. Now, these are completely discoverable. As soon as they focus in on it, they change. But for some people, just seeing a form that looks like that could present some barriers. So my first concern is this, that it's a lack of clear identification could be problematic for a range of different audiences, including some cognitive impairment users, and also people that are technology challenged. I don't know about anyone else, but one of the things I dread the most is having to go and sit with my parents and help them through some IT problem, and just have to watch them use the internet. And things like this, I know, would just be a huge barrier for them, because unless it looks like a button and smells like a button, then they're not going to click on it. And the same with an input box. Unless it looks like something they can type into, they're probably not going to understand that it's an input. My second concern is to do with low contrast labels. So in a range of different examples I've seen, the label in its initial state, before it slides up out of the control, is often very low contrast. And I think one of the reasons why they're doing that is to try and make it appear like it's a placeholder. And by default, a placeholder element is sort of soft grey. So here's a diagram to show what it can sometimes look like. So we've got the same sort of form. It's got first name, last name, and email. But all three of those examples are very, very soft. And the concern here is that critical information, now form labels are critical. If you can't read what those inputs are about, then the form won't be useful at all. So it could be really problematic for various types of vision impairment users. The third concern is almost the exact opposite, and that's this concern of, is it already filled in? Or is it even a form? So at the other end of the spectrum, if you make the label have too strong a contrast, some people could make the mistake of thinking there's a value and not a label at all. And so in this diagram, we have the same form, first name, last name, and email. But in this case, the labels are all very, very strong. In fact, they're black. And if a user came to this form, some types of users may not even think that that's a form at all, because there's actually information sort of in place already. Now, as soon as they click into it, most users will discover and learn about these sort of forms. But it just, again, has a barrier to some users. So potential issues. So again, problematic for potentially some groups of cognitively impaired and also technology challenged users. The fourth concern is about this idea that some of the labels are just too small. So I've seen examples where people make this label a tiny, tiny little thing that slides up out of the input, and it's a very small font size. So here's a quick demo of that, a diagram of that, and you can see that we have first name, last name, and email. They're very, very small. And on a small screen, you'd have to really squint or increase the font size to see it. So that could be problematic for a range of users, but particularly people with diminishing eyesight. And again, it's especially important. This is critical information. A form control is, the label associated with the form control is really important to get right. Another concern, which really is fundamental to everything we do, and that's a lack of focus state. So you couldn't really single out floating labels, but it's just something I've seen here as well, that in many cases the form controls have labels and they just have no focus state. So as you can imagine, this causes major issues for keyboard users, but even more than normal. The problem we've got here is that if you turn off all focus and the user tabs around a page, when they hit a normal input, it looks like an input. So at least there's a sense that they've entered a normal input. But if you're using this minimalist design and it doesn't even look like an input, and you've got no idea that it's in focus, you're really setting the bar very high for these types of audiences to know that it's an input and also learn to interact with it. So the bottom line with all this is test. So if you're thinking about doing something like this, just make sure you test with real users. And by real users, they should be the types of audience that are going to use your application or website or whatever it is. So you should be testing it in that real environment before going too far. Now, in some cases, if you've got users that are very tech savvy and it's in a very specific place, these can be really elegant and cool solutions. But if you're doing it on a large government website where you want the largest number of audience members to be able to understand that it's a form, to be able to fill in the form, etc., then these may not be the ideal solution. And of course, if you're going to do that, make sure you test with the widest possible audiences and assistive technologies as well. I mean, they're no-brainers, of course, but it should be said. So now let's talk about the different methods we've got out there. So there are two fundamental methods, and I'm going to talk about each of them and break them down a bit for us. So the first method is called the label-only method. And what that does, in the static state, the label's displayed on top of the input, and the input, when it receives focus, the label's animated upwards. Excuse me. So in this example, as one I showed you before, we have two diagrams. The label is soft and grey, and when the user clicks on the form, the label slides up and becomes blue above. So you get that little animation as it slides up. So that's just using the label element. And basically, you take CSS and you position it over the top of the input, and then allow it to slide up using animation. The second method, though, uses a combination of placeholder and label. So in this case, we have a static state. The placeholder is displayed first, and when the input receives focus, the placeholder gradually fades out, and the label is animated and then slides up into view. So a little diagram here again to show you. So we have the placeholder now in place first, rather than the label, and then this would happen at high speed, but the second semi-state, you'd have the placeholder now softening off and the label starting to appear, and in a final state, the label's above the element. So you get basically placeholder to label. So which one to use? Well, we're going to be looking at the second method. And the reason why I started to do this one for my testing was, one, because it was more complicated and therefore more fun, but two, it had one little benefit that I thought could be quite good, in that it allows us to do a separate placeholder and label value. So what this means is you could, in theory, give more detailed instructions in the placeholder and then have a simple label, or the other way around if you wanted. But a quick example, and this is a very crude example because, for your first name, you hardly need any more information. But you could have something like add your first name as a placeholder, and when the user clicks into it, it changes just to the simpler first name. So a very poor example, but it gives you that ability to be able to add more information and then simplify it when the user has clicked into that input itself. So now I'm going to talk briefly about the desired outcomes, what we want to achieve from this. So when I was looking around at a range of different solutions out there, there are a lot of things that irritated me about them or concerned me about them. And most of the concerns that I had, which I wanted to try and address here, is actually about this idea about them being discoverable. And again, this comes back to, I'm sure anyone that sits there watching people as a user tester, you want them, after you've seen so many people fail to be able to achieve simple tasks, you eventually get to a mindset where you want something to be as simple and as discoverable as it possibly can. So some of the concerns that I've seen with examples out there, they're not as discoverable as I'd like. So let's talk first about the static state. So before user interactions occur at all, as we saw before, the placeholder should be visible and the label should be hidden. So this little diagram shows the placeholder in place, and we've got a soft grey line under the form control, or the border bottom on the form control. The other thing is the placeholder should be of sufficient colour contrast so that it should meet WCAG guidelines. So in this case, I've set it to just on the barrier. It's set to the example of #666, and that is just on the AA compliant. Now, you could obviously make it darker, but what I found interesting is that little play of, if you make it too dark, it looks like a value. And if you make it too light, it has colour contrast issues. So trying to set that balance so it looked placeholdery enough without looking like a value, but also not being too soft. So now we get to probably the most important state, I feel, which is the hover state. So what I found was that I wanted users to discover the purpose of these very quickly. So if they roll their mouse over them, then it would actually change and look more like an input. So we're cheating a bit to try and give it a bit more discoverability. So if the user hovers over the form, the placeholder and the form control should change to indicate that it's now an interactive element. So my concern is that they don't look interactive. So if you hover over it, I want to make them look a little bit more interactive. And the way we can do that is to change so that the placeholder gets a bit darker. And the other thing I did was put a border on all sides of the element. And it's to make it this idea, oh, when you roll over it, oh, that's an input. So what we have here is two diagrams showing the static state and then the hover state. So what I wanted people to do if they rolled over it with their mouse, and keep in mind that's only 8% of users, but we wanted to make sure that when they rolled over it, it actually showed them, hey, this is actually an input. So it goes from a softer grey to a black colour or a dark colour. And the border goes from being just on the bottom to being all around the element. So it just gives them that extra hint, this is actually an input. And then we get to the focus state. Now this is obviously much more important for keyboard users. So we're going to bring in some similar things to do for hover, because they might not ever have the hover state. We want to make it discoverable for them as well. So if the user focuses on the form control via mouse click or tabbing, there's actually 4 things that are going to happen. The first thing is that the placeholder has to gradually fade out. The next thing is that label has to appear and animate slide up above the form control to imply that it's moving out. The next thing I do is put a border all around that element, like we did for the hover. So when you focus on the element, you get a quick understanding, oh, this is actually a form control. And the last thing, to me, is a really important little trigger, is we're going to set an additional border bottom that changes color. And that helps indicate that it's now in this thing called edit mode, for example. So here's our little diagrams. And what we're going to do is set the placeholder originally. And then in slow motion, what would happen if you clicked into that box via keyboard or mouse, you'd get the placeholder gradually fade and the label start to appear. And then when the label appears above, you're now in full edit mode. Now that would happen in a microsecond, obviously. You'd be placeholder to input. And now there's a border all around, but the border below is in blue to indicate we're now in sort of edit mode. We can start typing. Now the next thing we need to talk about is post-focus. That means you've actually filled it in and you've gone down to the next element if you're tabbing or you've clicked out of it with the mouse. So when the focus leaves the form control, 2 things need to happen. The label should remain but change color to indicate that it's no longer in edit mode and it's been completed. Now, you could change it to one of 2 colors. You could change it to something like green for success and red for failure. So, for example, it was an email address and they failed to write a valid email address. You could have the label changed to red once they jumped out, as well as having additional error messages below. Or if it was successfully completed, you could change it to green or something like that once they leave. So we need to change the color. And the other thing is we need to set the border bottom back to the original state because it's no longer in edit mode. So here's 4 little steps of our diagram again. We have our placeholder. When the user clicks into it, they jump to edit mode or it's in focus. And once they finish it and then move out, you can see now it's changed to post-focus mode. So the form has considered this to be valid, so it's now green. And the user input is in there. And as you can see, the border bottom is back to a soft grey. One of the other things that I really wanted to try and do is to make sure that the version I built was need no JavaScript. And there's a specific reason that I wanted to do that. And I don't know about a lot of you guys, but I find it interesting that JavaScript is so much part of web development these days. I mean, every site I work on these days has massive JavaScript libraries, and so much is controlled with JavaScript. But the problem with that is people start to use JavaScript for virtually everything. And one of my concerns is that should we be using things like JavaScript for something simple like just positioning and animating a form label? And if it could be done simply with CSS, wouldn't that be a better solution? Again, that's up to you guys, but that's something that I wanted to try and achieve. Now, in order to do that, I've had to use one little experimental CSS selector, the valid one, and I'll talk about that soon. But it just means this one little aspect may not work unless you've got a modern browser. But like anything, if we build using progressive enhancement, then that shouldn't be a problem. It should be stable across all browsers. For those who've never heard the term before, progressive enhancement is about this idea that we should be building things that are stable across all devices as a base, and then you enhance based on the capability of the device, etc. So you could add JavaScript as an enhancement, but have semantic HTML and solid CSS as your core. So let's now dive into the markup. We're going to talk first about the label placement. Now for this method, I needed the label information to appear after the form control in source order. Now the reason why I need to do that is, what I need to do is to style the label based on the state of the input. So what I mean by that is, if the user clicks on the input and it's now in focus state, I want to change the label based on that focus state. And so it allows me to do things like what's called an adjacent sibling selector. So in this case, it's pretty long-winded, but you can see I've got a class there and then :focus to say when this element is in focus and the next adjacent element is the label, do something. So that's only possible if that label, you'll see in a minute, it's not actually the label, but this element we're going to style comes after the focus. Again, with JavaScript, you can do this however you want. With CSS, we can only go down the document tree and not up. Now, I'm sure a lot of accessibility people are always grinding their teeth already about this, but but hold on. In an ideal world, label content should always be placed before the form controls in source order, except for radio buttons and checkboxes where the label content should be displayed afterwards. Now, I keep saying the word label content because there is a difference between label and label content. Sneaky. So first off, I'm going to use an ID and a for attribute to explicitly associate them. No brainer there. But we have our label, and we've got for, and I've got the ultra sexy class name ID of input 1. So that is tying the for and the ID together. That's part 1. Part 2 is I also wrap the label around the form control and the form contents, the label contents. So we have label wrapped right around all that stuff. And then finally, I place the label content inside a span element. So it's actually the content is sitting after the input, but the label wraps around the input and the span. And that means we can style the label content separately to the overall label and the form control. So there you can see it sitting there. We have span class in our case. I'll talk about the class names in a minute, but basically we're putting the label content in its own little span so that I can style that separately to the label itself or the input. So now let's actually talk about the class names. Now I build large pattern libraries for complex applications, and one of the most fundamental things is trying to come up with class names that are consistent and, again, using the word discoverable. So I use BEM, sort of BEM-esque naming class names. If you've never heard of that, it comes from block element module. But it fundamentally boils down to trying to use classes that fall into modules, submodules, or modifiers. And here's a quick piece of code to explain that. So these are all class names. And as you can see, the top one is called floating label. That's our module, or the parent. And when we have a submodule, we always double underscore them. So now we know it's a child or a submodule of that. So we have floating dash label underscore underscore control, or floating dash label underscore underscore label. So now we know that they're part of the overall label container, but it's a child of that, which is a control or a label. And then you can do, if you want, things like modifiers, and you do double dash. So you could have floating dash label dash dash something, or in this case, it's down deeper, floating dash label underscore underscore control dash dash disabled. And these are just very simple ways of making the class names more intuitive for developers. And this or similar methods are quite commonly used on a lot of large applications these days. So here they are in place, the three main ones. You can see we have a div, and it's got floating label as our class name. And then our second one is on the input itself, and that could be a text area or input. And it's got floating dash label underscore underscore input. And I think I actually changed that to control somewhere. So I think that's actually wrong. And then we have floating label underscore underscore label. That's the label content itself. Let's now look at the Sass or the SCSS that I'm going to use in here. So I'm going to quickly show some of this stuff and the stuff that's used to create the final working version, but I'm not going to show it all for you. because it'll take like 30 minutes to go through it all. But if you want, you can always go to the repo that I shared at the beginning of the video on the Twitter stream, and you can dig into the finer details of the CSS or the Sass there. Now, I keep saying SCSS rather than CSS because most of the stuff I work on these days uses SCSS. We haven't got to the point where CSS variables are widely supported and as powerful in use as SCSS, but it's definitely getting there. But really, this just gives us a lot more control, and in this case, just allows us to set some nice variables that can be then used throughout all the rest of the rules. So let's have a quick look at them. So these are all the variables, and I define them at the top of the SCSS file. And you can see that they're pretty standards, but it allows me to abstract out all of the things that I might need, like color of the input text, the color of the placeholder when it's hovered or disabled, the color of the label when it's focused, and all the borders, and even the font size itself. You can set them to whatever you want, of course. Now let's look at the parent. How do we style the very first element? So I need to set the parent to position relative. And the reason why we're going to do that is we're going to set the label itself to absolute, but we want it to be relative to the parent. Now, for those that aren't familiar with positioning in CSS, if you set something to absolute, it will look up through the document tree and try and find something else with position. And if it can't find some other element with positioning, it will go to the very root element, which is the body element, and position itself against that. So when you're styling something, if you want something to be positioned relative to a parent, you need to set the parent with some sort of positioning. And the safest one is position relative. So we're setting the floating dash label to position relative. And now anything we do inside with absolute position elements will always be positioned relative to this parent. Next up, we have the control. So this is the actual inputs and text areas. So we're going to set the border to transparent and then reset the border bottom to soft gray. And the reason why we do that is we can do it in 2 rules instead of 3 or 4, declarations instead of 3 or 4. So we've got border, 1px solid transparent, and then overriding these are, but on the case of border bottom, set it to whatever we want. Now then we need to style the focus and hover states. So in this case, we have floating label control, and you can see that I changed the class name from input to control at some point. Hover. So this will change the border when it's on hover. And you can see now the border's on all sides of that element, not just the bottom. And then we have focus, and you can again see the borders on all sides of the element. So this is done with floating dash label __ control : focus. So that's the focus pseudo class. Now I can style the input once it's been filled in using this valid pseudo class. Now, as I mentioned before, this is not supported except in the latest browser, but it really doesn't matter. It just gives us the ability to set it to green if we wanted once they've left. So if the form is valid, we can actually change the color, and we do that with floating dash label __ control : valid. And then we can set it to a different class or a different color or anything we want to do there. Now let's look at the label itself. So we need to set the label to position absolute because we need to position it out of the its current position and actually move it down and then animate it back up. So we're going to set the opacity to 0 to start with. And what we can do is set it to position top minus 15px. So it's moving down away from the parent 15px. And then we set the opacity to 0 if we want. And what happens then is when it comes into focus, we can set the opacity to 1, and we can use transition to ease it up a little bit and move it so that it comes into being opaque, and then you've got that slide animation up to minus 5px from where it was. And then the other aspect we want to do is to style the placeholder itself. Now this is actually really important because we really need some interaction with this element, and luckily now you can style it with a range of different selectors. So I'm going to style off the placeholder in various states. Now in reality, in the Git repo, you'll see that I have a variety of 4 different rules depending on different browsers for the placeholder, but I'm just going to show you one of them, and it's a much simpler version of it. So here we have, this one's for WebKit-based browsers, but there are other versions. We're saying the WebKit placeholder, set the opacity to 1. So that's its natural state. And the reason why I do that is I want to set its color. Some browsers actually have the opacity by default slightly lower. So I set it to 1, I set a color on it. And this will be the color we talked about before, that color that needs to be not dark black, but not too soft. And I try and set it around something like 666, something that's AA or whatever you need to be compliant. And then you'll see we've got an interesting problem here. Now we want to style it when it's in hover. So what we're doing here is floating label, control, but pseudo class of hover, only when it's in hover, then style the placeholder. And you can see we're changing the color. Well, the variable there is color placeholder hover, but fundamentally we're setting it to a darker color. When the floating label is set to hover, the placeholder will go darker. The next thing we're doing on the control, on the placeholder, is when the control is in focus, make the placeholder disappear. And so what we have is we set the opacity to 0 and transition in 1 second. So basically, when they click into it, it fades to an opacity of 0. So weirdly enough, we're almost done. I'm going to go out and show you the repo in a second. But before I leave the slides, I just want to talk about 2 very interesting, quite fantastic articles on this topic. Now, my slides are shared in the IDX channel there on Twitter. So if you look at that hashtag, you'll see my slides, and these 2 links will be in that slide deck. But basically, a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, maybe slightly less, I wrote a really good article on a lot of his concerns with floating labels and how problematic they are. This guy called Adam Silver. So I thought it was a fantastic article, and it really resonated because I was writing my own sort of issues at the time. Now, some of his were more design-based, but they're still really worth looking into. And then, interestingly enough, a guy called Matt D. Smith replied, and he said, but are they really that problematic after all? And it's definitely an article worth reading as well, for a number of reasons. One is because he put some very measured and articulate counterpoints. But the reason why I found it most interesting is this Matt D. Smith was the guy that really began the floating label movement. Now, I'm not sure he invented it, but I do know that I think it was on Dribble, the website where you can share screenshots. He was the first guy to actually show an animated version of how he thinks they should work. And it became sort of like the canonical version of how all of us have looked at floating labels. So Matt D. Smith is either fully responsible for it or at least heavily responsible for this whole floating label movement. So it's definitely worth looking at Adam Silver's articulation of all of the problems that he sees and Matt D. Smith's response on how he still thinks that they're a valid option. I think the fundamental thing here is life is never black and white. And I'm not here saying that these things are bad and they should never be used. I think in certain circumstances, they're fantastic. And in certain circumstances, they could be really problematic. As I've said, my main concerns around them being understood and discoverable for average users. So a lot of it comes down to your site, your audience, etc. So that's it for my slides. You can catch me on Twitter at RussMaxDesign, but I'm going to jump out, move across, and quickly show you 2 things. So this is my Git repo if you want to see it. It's RussMaxDesign/floating label. And it means you can clone it or download it and play with it to your heart's consent. And if you find problems with it, which is fantastic, you can fork it and tell me how bad it is and do a better version yourself. And as well as that, you can click on the link there or go directly to the actual demo page. Blow that up. We're going to have a very quick look at the actual floating label in action. So I'm going to try and tab down to it. So if we go back up. So here we go. Our example here, we're going to move across it. But first, it may be very hard for you to see on screen. But if I hover over it, you'll see that I've got this little bit of discoverability, setting them to a border all around the element to try and make it more discoverable if they hover over it. And if you tab into it, page again, there we go. You'll see as I tab in, the placeholder disappears and the first name slides up above. And you'll also see when we're in this focus state, there's still a soft border all around the element. And that again is trying to get this idea that you're interacting with an input here. When you've filled in your first name and move out of the form, assuming it's valid, you'll see that the first name has changed to a greeny colour, and now we've jumped down to the next form control. So we can travel on. I've got a disable one as an example. And the last example is in a text area. So you can see that it's more than just inputs. Now, of course, if you go back up, you can, as soon as you move back into it, it'll go back into a blue state, which means it's editable again. So the blue, the heading and that border bottom will go blue as soon as it comes back into focus. If we go down to the text area. I think that's it from me. I think I'm well before time. If anyone's still awake, I'm happy to take questions. And I think I'm going to unshare screen right now. That's it for me.
Thanks, Russ. That was very interesting. And I'm really looking forward to forking the demo and playing around with it myself.
The first question is, any questions?
Interesting one, I think, that came in on Twitter, which was, do you think there are times when it's acceptable for certain types of content, for example, placeholders, not to meet the level A requirement in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines? And perhaps should there be a kind of a different level of contrast ratio required for things where the kind of affordance needs to be a little bit less?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because ironically,
It is.
the placeholder itself fails. I've seen a lot of sites where developers have just said, actually, we don't need labels anymore. Placeholders are it. And I find that fundamentally problematic. Some people do a semi-good solution where they'll keep the label there and hide it off screen. But even so, if you're a keyboard-only user, if you come in and you've only got a placeholder there, and it's the default placeholder, it's often very soft and it doesn't meet requirements. So even on a base site, I always pump up the placeholder to be a little bit more strong. That's terribly worded English. To be a little bit stronger in strength than the default. But to answer your question, is there ever a time? It's a really hard one. I think it always depends on the audience. I would always err on the side of caution. And that's, again, because I've done a lot of big applications, a lot of banking applications, things like that, where you just can't afford to have people fail. If a user just, can't quite understand something, then, you've probably failed. And the last thing you want is someone not to be able to use their banking application. So generally speaking, I'd always err on the side of caution.
Okay. I think the other one of those, and I think somebody else mentioned it, maybe the same person on Twitter, is buttons or controls that are disabled. That tends to be the other time we kind of reduce the visual affordance.
Yeah, I don't mind that as much. I know exactly what you mean. And in fact, the example that I've got on that page is, I'm not sharing screen now, but it's a very soft grey. But I don't mind that nearly as much because you don't want them to interact with it. And generally speaking, if they can't read that label or that input, the fact that you've made it disabled means that fundamentally you don't want them to interact with it. So I'm much less concerned with those sort of things being softer. But yeah, it's a fascinating thing. I kept playing with the colours when I was doing this, and I've often done it with disabled as well. There's a tipping point where if the disabled is too dark and accessible, it actually doesn't look disabled anymore. Now, in the example that I've got on the repo, I've set the cursor so it's got that, that symbol which is, not accessible, don't click here sort of thing. But just simply make it too dark could make it look like a normal input. So there is a fine balance there you've got to get. No easy answer.
Yep. Nope, there never is there? Another question that came in on Twitter actually was just a very specific one, actually, with one of your code examples, where you had the label elements wrapped around the form control, but you were also making an explicit association with the for and ID attributes.
Yep.
Is that something you recommend as good practice?
I, again, always err on the side of caution. The reality is, in all of the devices, I used to, just as a background, about a year and a half ago, I used to sit for about 6 months. I sat in a bank 8 hours a day, in and out of all the different screen readers across about 5 different browsers, just jumping and jumping, testing little components. And I found that almost across the board now, just wrapping the label around them was enough. But I always just thought, in the old days, we used to have to be very, very explicit. And I found that it was just, a bit more bulletproof. I knew that it worked back in older versions of JAWS and things like that, where there wasn't, the screen readers are so much more sophisticated now that they do allow for just the label to be enough. But again, I suppose do over the top just to make sure it works backwards across a much older screen readers, etc.
Right, and somewhere in my memory, I've got a feeling it was speech recognition tools actually that were still the ones that struggled with the implicit labels. So, and as you say, especially if you're designing for banking websites where the audience really does include everybody and anybody in the general public, be cautious. Yeah, absolutely. Have you seen any trends kind of emerging on the sort of the visual design front that are either making things harder or easier from an accessibility, inclusive design point of view?
I'm not sure. I think one of the things that I'm sure you guys have struggled with a lot as well is there was a period where web standards and accessibility was suddenly trendy and everyone was talking about them. I think it sort of was around 2005, 2006, around that time. And suddenly everyone that I spoke to, seemed to be aware of them. And then suddenly when, I'm going back a long way here, some people probably weren't even born then, but then this thing called Ajax appeared and suddenly everyone could use JavaScript in a really rich way. And one of the things I noticed is people that I used to deeply respect and their knowledge of web standards, they just threw everything out. They just got incredibly excited by it all. And rich interaction was more important. Accessibility just fell by the wayside. So that was a trend that I noticed. And I don't think that's changed at all. But I have noticed that there's also a design trend now. With the floating labels, there's a design trend to do almost the same as the development trend, to jettison anything that is helpful to people in pursuit of what's cool. And that's probably a little bit harsh, but these sort of things, and the guy who invented this, that was never his intention, but I've noticed that people are taking away things that are natively understandable and trying to push that barrier so that they're more and more elegant, but less and less form-like. And along the way, they're potentially alienating a percentage of the audience.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with that. And just taking things, because obviously you're our first speaker in from Australia in ID24. How is the accessibility kind of community in Australia? I know there's big things happening in government, and I'm aware of a lot of meetups taking place.
Yes,
it sounds like it's a very vibrant. Yep.
Yeah, amazing.
And you run a meetup, is that right?
No, I used to run a group called Web Standards Group for many years, but through just being burnt out, I stopped that. But then there's some fantastic groups, he says, trying to think of who they are. Well, one is the amazing Aussie Way, which has been going since the very early days. That's an annual event. But there are all sorts of accessibility meeting, A11Y, Bytes, Ali Bytes, held an event just recently. They've got a camp coming up in September. So yeah, the accessibility community is really flourishing in Australia. Unfortunately, like anything, you just wish it could go out to a broader audience.
Absolutely, and for that we're very, very grateful to have your contribution and involvement in ID24, because that's a big part of what we're trying to accomplish with this. So thank you very much for being there from down under. Great. We're going to be taking another short break now. We'll be back at the top of the hour with our next talk. Europe is waking up and coming online, so we'll have our first speaker from Europe, Eric Eggert, who's going to be giving a wonderfully named talk called Aria Serious. So time for that power nap and some more tea and coffee. We'll see you all back here in just a little while.
Thank you all.